So here we are in just the second week of the story. And already we've come to what's one of the most difficult, one of the most appalling stories in the entire Bible. The story of when God comes to Abraham and tells Abraham to go and sacrifice his son Isaac. And you know, if this is your first week, if you missed last week, this is your first experience in the story. And why is it that we get such an appalling story so soon? I mean, what kind of God would command Abraham to kill his son, and what kind of follower would go along with it? Why does it come so soon? You know, even for the ancient Hebrews, it's just the 22nd chapter of the Bible. Things are just getting started. Why would you get something so difficult so soon? It's almost like you were in a class and the teacher decided to give the final exam as soon as you got the syllabus. Is it likely to make you take off running and never look back as it is to make you push through? Why do we have this story? Especially, why does it come so soon when we're just still kind of cozying into our sermon series and our look at the Bible? Well, the reason it comes so soon is because there's something in this story that we need to know about God before we commit to going on this long journey with God. But there's also something in this story that God needs to learn about us before God commits to journey alongside us. And it's all in this story. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. It comes in Genesis chapter 22, and it begins like this. The Bible reads, "After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, 'Abraham,' and he said, 'Here I am.' He said, 'Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you.' So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, 'Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you.' Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, 'Father,' and he said, 'Here I am, my son.' He said, 'The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?' Abraham said, 'God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son.' So the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and then laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son." Again, what kind of God would give that command, and what kind of follower would follow through? It seems to be a terrible, appalling story. What do we make sense of it? How do we make sense of it? And, you know, a clue comes to us in the first words, and as we read through the Bible throughout this year, as we read through the stories, it's always important to pay attention to the first words and the last words of any story or any scene, because the first words and the last words are always dripping full of meaning. And the first words of this story are "after these things." Well, after what things? Abraham first appears in the story in Genesis chapter 12 when God calls to him. At this point, Abraham goes by the name Abram, and his wife Sarah goes by the name Sarai, and God calls out to them and tells them to get up and go, to leave their country and their kinfolk and their hometown and go to the land that God will show them, and there God will bless them. God promises to make out of them a great nation, to bless them, to make their names great, to bless those who bless them, and the one who curses them, God will curse. And through them, the entire families of the world will be blessed. It's a great promise that comes to Abraham and Sarah. But one thing we need to know about that promise is at this point, Abraham's 75 years old. Sarah's 65 years old. And at that point in time, there's no Medicare, there's no Social Security, there's no 401k, there are no retirement plans. They're not moving to some retirement village like Wesley Commons. They're not going someplace in Florida with golf and bingo and bridge. They're setting off into unknown territory. They're going alone. Only their nephew Lot goes with them. And in those days, the worst thing that anyone could think of was dying away from home, dying away from their family, dying away from their hometown, because there were no safety nets. There was no family. There was no comfort. There was no support system. And yet they go. That's the great faith of Abraham and Sarah, is that they go. That's why we remember them for their faith. That's why growing up I learned the song about Father Abraham has many sons, because of their faith. And they get up and go. They go to the promised land, which God shows them, but they're not there very long. Less than 5 years, when things begin to go in a way that God hadn't hoped. You see, there's a famine in the land, and so Abraham and Sarah leave the promised land. They go down to Egypt to seek relief from the famine. And while they're there, Abraham's afraid that his wife, who, now at 65 years old, but still a looker, he's afraid that Pharaoh's going to see his wife and want her, and that Pharaoh will kill him and take her. And so he tells the Egyptians, no, that's not my wife. That's my sister. And so then Pharaoh takes Sarah to be his wife. And in addition to how terrible this story is on chauvinistic grounds, and in addition to how terrible this story is in terms of the treatment of Sarah, it also shows a lack of faith in God. Hadn't God just told him that God was going to make a great nation out of them? Hadn't God just told him that God was going to protect them? And that would include protecting Abraham's life so he could have that nation. But the first time pressure turns up, Abraham's faith wavers. Doesn't trust God to keep God's promises. But God isn't done with Abraham. Instead, God comes back to Abraham and God repeats the promise to Abraham, this time making it more explicit. He takes Abraham outside one night and tells Abraham to look up into the sky. And he says, Abraham, count the stars if you can. As many stars as there are in the sky, that's how many descendants you're going to have. God repeats the promise. God will make a great nation out of Abraham and Sarah. God will bless them. But then time goes on. And after they've been in the promised land about 10 years, Abraham's now 85, Sarah's 75, they're still yet to have a kid. Never had a child, still don't have one. God had promised it, still hasn't come. And so Sarah decides to take matters into her own hands. She goes to Abraham and says, hey, Abraham, why don't you take my servant Hagar? Take her as your concubine so that then you can have a child. And Abraham does, and they have a child, and a boy, and his name's Ishmael. And Abraham loves the child, and God loves the child, but it's still not what God had meant. God had come to Abraham and Sarah and said that they together would have a child. But again, they'd not trusted God to keep God's promises. When 10 years had gone by, their faith wavered. They'd taken matters on their own hands. But again, God comes to them and repeats the promise. No, what I meant, I still mean. The two of you together will have a child, and out of him there will be a great nation. And in fact, we're going to call this child Isaac, which means he laughs. Because when God told them that they would have this child, which eventually they have when Abraham's 100 and Sarah's 90, both Abraham and Sarah had laughed. And I guess it would be kind of funny to hear having a kid at 190, but they do. They do have this child, and they name him Isaac. But before he's born, after they're told they'll have him before he's born, again, Abraham has passed off his wife as his sister. This time to King Abimelech of Gerar for the same reason. Apparently at 90 she could still get men's attention, and he was sure that he would be killed so that the king could have her. So again he said she was his sister and not his wife. Again, he didn't trust God to protect him and to fulfill God's promises. It's after these things, after God has watched Abraham's faith waver 3 times, that God decides to test Abraham by commanding him to sacrifice Isaac. Yes, Abraham and Sarah had set off with great faith, but then every time God had turned around, God just saw their faith wavering, and this was nothing new. If you were here last week, you heard Pastor Carl talk about what happened in the story before Abraham shows up on the scene. It begins when God looks out into the chaos and decides to create the world, and God creates that world out of chaos, and it's good. And in fact, when it's done, it's all very good. And God goes about blessing the world. He creates it and He keeps it going perfectly and beautifully. And God goes about blessing the first people, Adam and Eve, directly. He meets them in the garden to go for walks. But then they become disobedient. And they sin, and calamity comes upon the world. But God doesn't give up on them. Yes, God punishes them. Yes, God kicks them out of the garden, but God goes with them so that God can continue to bless them. But then in the second generation, what happens? Cain kills his brother Abel, and violence enters the world. And then the violence just continues, and it becomes more and more widespread until everywhere God looks, God sees violence and wickedness, and God decides, enough of this, I'm just going to destroy it all. But then God sees a man who's righteous and blameless, and that man's Noah. And God decides to save that man and his family on the ark. And He'll flood the world and He'll destroy all the wickedness. But God will keep up that righteous family in hopes that they can start over, in hopes that that family will get it right, that God can bless that family and the entire world and it will all work out. But no sooner does the flood end, and no sooner do they get off the boat, that one of Noah's sons falls back into disobedience. Calamity and sin are upon the world again. But God blesses Noah's other sons and thinks, well, maybe with them, maybe this time it'll work out and I can bless them and bless the world and everything will be great. But it's not too long before the people are at it again. They're disobedient again. This time they're trying to build a tower all the way up to heaven to glorify themselves. And when God sees it, God's heart breaks. Every time God had said about trying to bless the world, the people just turned away. And so God says, you know what, I'm going to try something new. This attempt to bless the entire world all at one time directly, it's not working, so I'm going to try something new. I'm going to pick one couple and one family and one people, and I'm going to bless them. So that when people see them and when people see me at work in them and they see my power and my presence at work in them, they're going to want what that family, what that people has, and then they'll come to know me, and then they'll come to know the blessing that I intend for the entire world. And God picks that couple. It's Abraham and it's Sarah, and it starts out so well, just like creation had started so well, and just like the world after the flood had started out for just a little while so well. It's all starting out well again, and God's hopes are up, and then Abraham's faith wavers again and again and again. It's after these things, after all of these things, creation and fall and disobedience and calamity and flood and tower and the call of Abraham and Abraham's own lack of faith. It's after all of these things that God decides to test Abraham. Wondering, is Abraham just going to be like all the others? Is Abraham going to let me down like all the others? Am I just going to be let down and betrayed and left alone again? And so God gives this test, but this time Abraham is faithful, even to the point of taking up a knife, at which point God's heart, which was at the point of breaking, fearing that Abraham would let him down just like all the others before, now God's heart bursts forth with relief. And we hear the end of the story when God then, through an angel of the Lord, when God calls out from heaven saying, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. And the angel said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God. Now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And after the angel speaks those words, Abraham looks up, and there in a thicket he sees a ram whose horns have been caught in the thicket. And Abraham takes that ram and slaughters it and offers it to God in place of Isaac. But don't miss those words that God says. Now I know. I know that when we talk about God, we like to use a lot of those words that begin with omni. God's omnipotent. God's all-powerful. God's omnipresent. God is present everywhere. God is omniscient. God is all-knowing. But yet if we take God at God's word from the Bible, God learned something from Abraham that day. God learned something that God desperately needed to know, to the point that God was willing to give a desperate command, a command that we need to say was only given one time in the Bible. God never again commanded anyone to sacrifice a child. We know from history that that took place in some of the religions around Israel, but God never requested that from anyone again. It only came at one time. A time in which God was desperate to know something. You see, what God had offered Abraham back when he took him out to look at the stars in the sky is a very special thing in the Bible. It's called a covenant. And what the word covenant means in the Bible is a mutual promise of love and faithfulness. Covenant is a mutual promise of love and faithfulness. And like any kind of promise of love and faithfulness, it requires total vulnerability. Not just the kind that Abraham showed God, but also the kind that God showed Abraham. You see, God had decided to make God's plan for that upper story, the story of God's love and hopes and dreams for all of creation. God had decided to make that plan vulnerable on the faithfulness of one man and one family in the lower story. One family living life just like us. God had decided to make God's plans to bless the entire world vulnerable to the faithfulness of one people. And God was excited about that plan. But he'd seen Abraham let him down like everyone else, and God was desperate to know that would it work this time? Because God was vulnerable. God had offered Abraham that covenant, just like God offers us the same covenant. A relationship of mutual love and faithfulness. And the same is true for us. Just like God decided to be vulnerable to Abraham for the blessing of the entire world, God still chooses to be vulnerable to us for the blessing of the world. God still chooses to work through the church to bless the entire world. That's part of what it means when God offers us a covenant. God offers us this mutual relationship of love and faithfulness. God offers us this relationship of mutual vulnerability. Asking us, will we be vulnerable to go where God sends us? And God offering to be vulnerable to us. To use us to be part of God's plan of blessing the entire world. And I know where God might send us can be scary, but we need to know God's not going to ask us to sacrifice our children. That was a one-time only thing when God was at God's most desperate and most vulnerable point. But there might be other things that God asks us to sacrifice along the way. And we'll just have to see how the story unfolds. As for Abraham, God kept God's promise and made that great nation out of Abraham. Abraham's two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. Ishmael became the father of 12 princes. Isaac became the father of two sons, Jacob and Esau. And Esau became the father of 5 sons and several daughters. And Jacob became the father of at least one daughter and 12 sons, one of whom is Joseph. And that's where we're going to pick up the story next week, with the story of Joseph. But today, before we go, we're going to come here to the table as we come every week. But it's important to note, as we read the Bible and as we read through the Bible, we're going to see themes and motifs just repeat themselves. And it's not surprising because God is the same yesterday and today and forever. And so the way God was at work then is the way God is at work throughout the entire Bible and the way God is at work now. And so we're going to see stories that seem to have a little rhyme and a resonance with something that we've heard before. And one of those will have to do with the story of Abraham. For you see, when God sent Abraham to the land of Moriah to go up on the hill with his only son, later in the story we're going to find out that the land of Moriah, that mountain where Abraham went, was actually the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Abraham went to Jerusalem with his only son Isaac. God commanding to make that sacrifice, which God eventually withdraws. Well, sometimes later, thousands of years later, another only son. A son who is fully man and fully God. Son of Abraham and son of God will be back on a mountain in Jerusalem. And that son, Jesus, will give his life for us. In that son, Jesus, the vulnerability of God and the vulnerability of man come together in one offering. Just like in that moment, it was part of God's plan to bless the entire world. So in that moment of Jesus on the cross in Jerusalem, it's the culmination of God's plan to bless the entire world. That descendant of Abraham named Jesus, through whom the entire world, including us, might be blessed. And we come here today to this table to remember that, to thank God for that, and to share in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ as we share in the meal that he shared with his disciples before he died for us.